Hello, I'm Nima Rajan. 3 Minneapolis police officers are due in court today on charges of second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter in connection with the Memorial Day murder of George Floyd. Yesterday, prosecutors also upgraded the charge against the officer who pressed his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck to second-degree murder. The first of 3 memorial gatherings for Mr. Floyd will be held this afternoon, led by civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton. Demonstrators marched to the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday night, protesting the death of George Floyd and demanding that laws be changed to prevent more like it. Pro-democracy politicians tried to disrupt the vote, but in the end, Hong Kong's legislature approved a contentious bill that makes it illegal to insult the Chinese national anthem. Opponents see the law as an infringement of freedom of expression and a sign of China tightening control over the territory. Today is the 31st anniversary of China's bloody crackdown on pro-democracy protests in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Thousands of people in Hong Kong defied a police ban and broke through barricades to mark the anniversary of the massacre, lighting candles and observing a minute of silence. Religious leaders are stepping more directly into the politics surrounding discrimination during the recent protests after the killing of George Floyd. Groups of multiple denominations across Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faiths have publicly called for action against racism, aligning with peaceful demonstrators' goals. The diversity of religious involvement in the ongoing protests suggests a possible sea of change for faith-driven engagement in racial justice issues. Democrats in the U.S. Congress are working furiously to draft a sweeping package of police reforms. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus say this is a moral moment in their country's history. Both the Senate and House efforts are expected to include changes to police accountability laws, revamped training requirements, including a ban on chokeholds, and the creation of a database of police use of force incidents. Well, in his daily briefing today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said new federal modeling shows that COVID-19 is in decline across Canada, but the country is not out of the woods. He says the continuing threat means that as more people start working out in public, adhering to physical distancing measures and wearing masks remains very important. And he says the country will have to do better at testing and tracing contacts of people who contract the novel coronavirus to stamp out flare-ups. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is taking part in his 3rd international summit in a week as Canada pushes for a coveted spot on the United Nations Security Council. The PM is campaigning on a platform of helping to rebuild the post-pandemic world. Today's summit, hosted by British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, is aimed at ensuring poor countries will have ready access to an eventual vaccine for the deadly coronavirus that causes COVID-19. The International Pledging Conference hopes to raise nearly $10 billion for the Vaccine Alliance, which is the leading agency for distributing vaccines to less developed countries. Canada's merchandise trade deficit more than doubled between March and April. Statistics Canada reports exports fell to their lowest level in more than a decade, plunging almost 30% to $32.7 billion. The data reflects the impact of steps taken to slow the spread of COVID-19 as manufacturing companies shut down, retailers closed, and energy prices fell. The number of COVID-19 deaths across the country is expected to rise above 7,500 this morning. There are now 93,085 confirmed and presumptive cases of the novel coronavirus in Canada. Health officials are urging people attending anti-racism rallies to spread respect and tolerance, not the virus. Manitoba may expand a program to pay some frontline workers a bonus for putting themselves at risk during the COVID-19 pandemic. Earlier this week, Premier Brian Pallister announced that some workers who make $2,500 or less a month would be eligible. But now, he says, if there aren't enough applicants for the $120 million program, the government may open it up to higher wage earners such as nurses. A cluster of COVID-19 cases in northern New Brunswick is growing and has now spread to neighboring Quebec. Public health officials for the Atlantic province reported 2 new cases on Wednesday, saying that one case is a close contact of a previous case in the cluster. The other is linked to a long-term care facility hit with 8 cases, including 5 residents and 3 employees. It is believed that the outbreak began after a New Brunswick doctor traveled to Quebec and did not self-isolate upon return. Today, New Brunswick reported its first death from COVID-19. The United States has delivered another batch of ventilators to Russia as part of a $5.6 million humanitarian donation to help the country cope with the pandemic. The U.S. Embassy said the second shipment of U.S.-manufactured breathing machines arrived in Moscow on Thursday. Russia has reported more than 440,000 coronavirus infections with over 5,000 deaths. Officials have scrambled to secure ventilators and other essential supplies. Russia sent a plane load of medical supplies, including ventilators, to the U.S. in April. Russia's State Investment Fund said this week that it fully funded the delivery. A top UN humanitarian rights official is urging some Asia-Pacific governments to be cautious in their efforts to stop the spread of misinformation about the coronavirus outbreak, and warning of a clampdown against freedom of expression in the region. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights cited a further tightening of censorship in several countries and the arrest and detention of people who had either criticized their governments or shared information about the pandemic. The office said arrests for expressing discontent or allegedly spreading false information has been reported in a dozen Asian Pacific countries. Well, SpaceX crews didn't take much time off to celebrate their recent historic launch of 2 U.S. astronauts from Cape Canaveral, Florida, into orbit and onto the International Space Station. Following a quick turnaround, Elon Musk's private space company launched another Falcon rocket. This time, it was carrying a batch of small broadband satellites that will link up with more than 400 already in orbit and ultimately offer a worldwide internet service. Well, that'll do it for today's news update. I'm Nima Rajan. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you next time.